There are several versions of the quote, "Love people, not things, use things, not people," attributed to various deep thinkers. This past 18 months, we've had to figure out how to use new things and reimagine how to use some familiar things. Zoom, groceries being delivered, masks. We've realized how much we need to be around people we love whenever we'd like. In the words of one of our responsive readings, all our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us. As the staff was planning the themes and arc of the church year, we thought we needed to suggest ways to reimagine the immense changes we have all experienced over the past year and a half. But we also wondered how we would wed the idea of reimagining to the annual liturgical and cultural events that we observe here at First Church. In December, we will wind down and wrap up the calendar year and look ahead to the next. In the grayness of winter, we are given the gift of a new start. So, in December, we will be reimagining possibilities. November has, for centuries in North America, seen harvest festivals and the celebration of Thanksgiving. In November, we will be reimagining gratitude. But we thought it might be unfair, if not a bit tone-deaf, to reimagine these things that lean into the positive without first acknowledging the difficult experiences the pandemic has presented. Although we certainly didn't ask for it, and whether or not we realized it at the time, we have incurred losses in multiple forms. While we necessarily addressed many of these things throughout the pandemic from the pulpit, it now seems clear that any normal we may return to will be a new normal. This presents us with a perfect opportunity to reimagine significant facets of and events in our lives, including loss. It strikes me that many of us have had a tendency, especially during the pandemic, to downplay our losses or even rank and compare them to others. Some of us were able to say, well, at least I haven't gotten sick, or at least I still have my job. But I would wager that only the most physically or emotionally isolated have come away from this pandemic unscathed. Some losses were more devastating than others, but there are many kinds of losses. One website lists more than 40 events that can trigger grief. So I guess if we think about it, it seems understandable and perhaps even inevitable that the economic, social, and emotional losses of the past 18 months are real and have really affected us. Now, some people have lost jobs and loved ones, and we tend to know how to recognize that grief when it happens. And we acknowledge other life-changing types of losses, a separation or divorce, a bad medical prognosis, retirement, a change in one's financial state, a child leaving home, moving or changing schools. But there's also a disenfranchised grief, a grief that isn't typically acknowledged or supported by social ritual. Some people have lost the chance to go to their senior prom, or have their dream wedding, or long planned for vacation, or that first year of college on campus, or this ambiguous grief is a loss that occurs without closure or clear understanding, and often results in unresolved feelings. Yes, some had a metaphorical bucket of water poured on their head, but we have all had the drip, drip, drip from a rusty pipe in the ceiling leak onto our head for 18 months. Some are soaked, some are damp, but none of us are dry. It's easy to imagine that significant losses, like a death or divorce, would be considered the ones that really throw us for a loop. And they do. But these prolonged, smaller, and uncertain losses, like we've been experiencing throughout this time, can affect us deeply. And we need to acknowledge these and not apologize for having to deal with these losses. There are many ways to deal with a loss. In the poem, Mary Oliver's friend Daniel told her, "It's not the weight you carry, but how you carry it. Books, bricks, grief. It's all in the way you embrace it, balance it, carry it when you cannot and would not put it down." The very definition of loss assumes we'll react in a negative way. Loss is a thing, a noun, defined as a detriment, disadvantage, or deprivation from failure to keep, have, or get. I would think that, reduced to its essence, loss might simply be defined as, well, once you had it, but now you don't. There are various UU ministers groups on Facebook. This week I posted, "I'll be talking about loss Sunday. What are some reactions to loss besides grief? When are people relieved or happy due to some sort of loss?" Now, I intentionally did not specify what kind of loss, but found it interesting that most people did assume I was referring to the death of a loved one. They didn't list many positive reactions. One suggested that when a child loses a tooth, it's often fun and exciting. It occurred to me that losing weight when you're trying to is met with good feelings. Several people mentioned the feeling of relief. For instance, when an abuser dies, the abused can finally feel relief. Or when a death has been prolonged and the person suffered, the caregiver can be relieved. But then, sometimes they feel guilt at feeling relieved, that this difficult role has been lifted from them. They also suggested other responses like fear, numbness, and anger. Working as a chaplain, I found some people seemed to need permission to feel anger. They thought it was wrong to be angry at God for the death of a loved one. I assured them God could handle it. As I thought about loss and grief, I realized that no one calls the chaplain with good news. No patient ever called me to the room to share that there was no longer any sign of cancer. No mother excitedly shared that her baby was happy and healthy. When a child loses a baby tooth, they hope for a visit from the tooth fairy, not the chaplain. There's a couple of reasons for that, but mostly their friends and family are more than happy to share good news. But they don't know how to deal with bad news. They don't know what to do or say. People have a harder time with grief than joy, and people avoid suffering, their own and others. But it's not easy to avoid suffering. In the first of the Four Noble Truths, the Buddhists taught us that life is suffering, that the very nature of human existence is inherently painful. The second of the Four Noble Truths tells us that suffering has identifiable causes, craving and attachment. I take that to mean suffering when we don't get what we crave, and grief when we lose those peoples and things we're attached to. The third truth tells us that craving and attachment can be overcome. And the fourth gives us an eightfold path to doing so. But I think the fact that we can pretty much count on one hand those who have succeeded at this, ever, we know it's not an easy thing to do. So, while it may not be imminent that we will overcome suffering, perhaps in the meantime we can reimagine grief. We often imagine grief as a terrible emotion, but grief has been described as the response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or some living thing that has died. And up to this point this morning, I've repeatedly referred to grief as a reaction. It might be more accurate to say, however, that grief is a multitude of reactions that come and go. Not just an emotional response, the series of reactions may include physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical aspects. How many of us were inexplicably exhausted during the pandemic? Or couldn't focus because of COVID brain? And a lot of asking, why is this happening now to us? As well as a mixed bag of responses, it might be helpful to reimagine grief as a process of healing. According to one hospital website, there are many powerful emotions that can accompany grief, such as sadness, anger, guilt, and despair. But grief itself is the natural process that allows for those feelings to be experienced, accepted, expressed, and worked out. In that respect, grief is not your enemy. It is your friend. Grief is not a reason to be hopeless, but a reason to have hope that you will find your way back to a life very much worth living. Some have even imagined that there are specific, orderly stages one can go through in order to grieve properly in a timely manner. But in reality, there is no timeline to grieve. When you lose a loved one, you will never stop grieving, but your grief will become more manageable over time. In the book Tuesdays with Morrie, Mitch Albom writes, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." Not only do we need to reimagine any sort of timeline for grief, but any sense of orderly stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously suggested that mourners pass through 5 stages. Well, she was actually talking about adjusting to her own impending death, not the death of someone else. And her work has sometimes been universalized in unhelpful ways. We may all work through stages of grief, but they won't be in any prescribed order or commit to a timeline. Reimagine that there is no right way to grieve, except for the way that is right for you. Some may think that if not the right way, well, at least the easier way is to avoid the pain. Just ignore it and it'll go away. But grief that is unaddressed, put aside, numbed, stuffed down, or shut off can grow bigger and less manageable. In a sermon I preached in July of 2020 called Ritual, Hope, and Lament, I quoted a chunk of Brené Brown's wildly popular TED Talk about vulnerability. She said, "We live in a vulnerable world, and one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence. We are the most in-debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is that you cannot selectively numb emotion." She goes on to talk about how we can't numb unpleasant emotions we don't want without numbing the emotions we do want, like joy and gratitude. In our second reading, Reverend Lewis went so far as to say, "I think grief puts us in touch with our vulnerabilities. I think the feeling of grief lets us know the power of wounds to shape our stories." So, we must deal with the bad to progress toward the good. Be open to and work through the unpleasant emotions if we want to really feel the good ones, like hope and gratitude. And so we can find our way back to a life very much worth living. Like we anticipate a new normal after the pandemic, whenever that'll be, there will be a new normal after the process of healing we're calling grief. and that process requires us to be vulnerable. But getting in touch with our vulnerabilities is no fun. Who wants their friends and co-workers seeing their broken heart? So some have imagined that the right way to grieve is to show little evidence of it to the world. Stiff upper lip and all that. I can think of at least two reasons for this. One, we think we need to appear strong. No one wants to be around a sad sack, we think. I'll soldier through this. You use, tending to be both fiercely independent and analytical, sometimes don't want to appear to give in to our emotions or bother others with our emotional needs. Others might think that appearing devastated by a loss shows they do not have enough faith or are not properly turning their burdens over to a higher power. Well, of course, pain and suffering are not evidence of a lack of faith. Some of the so-called spiritual greats of history suffered from deep grief and depression. These last two sentences are from a website that debunks myths about grieving. From what I've read about Western religious leaders, it is true that some of them modeled suffering for us. But this rather flies in the face of what I described about overcoming suffering in Buddhism. So I begin wondering, do we really want to overcome craving and attachment? I mean, it seems obvious we do. After all, those are the very things that cause suffering. But if we overcome that suffering that causes the bad emotions, will we still get to experience the good emotions? Brene Brown led me to wonder that. Then I ask, why is all this so difficult? I once, and don't ask me why, decided to do an experiment while riding a roller coaster at Six Flags. While waiting in the extra long line for the front seat of the coaster with a friend, it occurred to me that once seated and seatbelted, if I closed my eyes and relaxed my body, I could experience the ride with no fear. And it worked. But I realized as I exited the ride and walked toward Bubba's Texas Giant hot dogs that while I hadn't experienced fear, I really hadn't experienced any fun either. I might as well have stood in line at Bubba's and read the menu. We can't numb unpleasant emotions we don't want without numbing the emotions we do want. But then I wonder, maybe we could have it both ways. What if we decided to do away with the craving and keep the attachment? Not in a stop wanting more but keep the stuff we have kind of way. In a stop wanting stuff and appreciate our attachments to other people kind of way. I once worked with a guy who told me about his house burning down years before. A devastating loss I would not want anyone to have to experience. He reported that he learned you can live without things you thought you could never live without. So, the conclusion I came to was, we do need to be vulnerable to experiencing the bad responses to loss and work through, with others, the process of grieving as we heal. Mary Oliver assured us, that time I thought I could not go any closer to grief without dying. I went closer, and I did not die. I wondered, maybe that pain isn't worth it when we lose things, but is totally worth it when we lose people, the people we love. Maybe that's what the Buddha meant when he said, life is suffering. Love people, not things. Use things, not people. Amen.